The air was thick with rot and poison. It clung to everything like an unseen predator, curling through the dense vegetation, seeping into the stagnant pools of water that stretched endlessly in every direction. The swamp breathed, exhaling waves of acrid mist that burned the lungs and blurred the edges of reality. Somewhere in the distance, something moved beneath the surface. Slow, deliberate ripples breaking the viscous film of decay. And then there was her. Evers struggled, her body half submerged in the sickly green-black sludge. The swamp had her now, pulling her under with greedy, insidious fingers. The moment she had slipped, it had been too late. Her weight had broken the fragile crust of tangled roots, plunging her straight into the toxic depths. She could feel the burn of foreign chemicals against her skin, eating away at the fine fabric of her suit, burrowing into her flesh like tiny invisible parasites. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, her normally sharp mind dulled by the fumes. She had trained for survival. She was supposed to be stronger than this, but nothing in her world had prepared her for this kind of death. Panic clawed at her chest as she fought to pull herself free, her long fingers scrabbling against the gnarled roots jutting from the swamp's edge. The wood was slick, covered in a thin film of some kind of fungal secretion, and her grip failed her. She slipped again, sinking deeper, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her people would not come for her. Avarice clenched her teeth against the bitter truth. They would have calculated the risk and deemed her loss acceptable. Even if someone had been near enough to see her fall, they would not have acted impulsively. There would be discussion, analysis, a strategic decision made, and by the time they reached a conclusion, if they decided at all, she would already be part of the swamp's endless hunger. Her strength was fading. The poison in the air clouded her thoughts, turning her limbs heavy, her pulse erratic. The world around her blurred into shadows and light. She barely registered the sudden movement, a dark shape cutting through the mist, swift and deliberate. And then, impact. Something hit the water hard, sending a cold shockwave against her body. Before she could react, arms wrapped around her, strong and unyielding. She was being lifted, pulled toward the surface in a surge of movement so powerful that for a moment the swamp felt weightless. Avarice gasped as she broke free from the sludge, air flooding into her burning lungs. The sudden clarity sent a jolt of panic through her system. Someone had grabbed her. Someone was touching her. And not just anyone. A human? She knew even before she saw him, before her blurred vision locked onto the rugged, mud-streaked face above her. The details were undeniable. The roughness of his features, the raw, unfiltered intensity in his gaze, the sheer, unrelenting force of his movements. There was no calculation in his actions, no hesitation, just instinct. Avarice tensed, her muscles locking in fear, but she was too weak to resist. The human held her close, his grip firm as he fought against the swamp's pull. His body radiated heat, so unnatural compared to the cool, sterile touch of her own kind. His breath was ragged, but there was no sign of hesitation, no sign of strain. He was built for this. Humans weren't supposed to be stronger than her kind. Her people had always whispered that they were fragile, a species bound by their chaotic emotions, their primitive ways. And yet this human was moving through the deadly swamp as if it were nothing. Then she felt something, not just his strength, but the resistance of a tether pulling them both toward the shore. Her eyes flickered downward, and through the haze of exhaustion she saw the thick rope, slick with mud, wrapped around his forearm. It extended behind him, tied securely around the trunk of a massive tree on the shore. He had planned for this. Instead of simply wading through the treacherous sludge, he had anchored himself first, securing an escape before diving in. Every pull of the rope brought them closer to safety, his body working in sync with the tension, using leverage rather than brute force alone. Not just reckless instinct. Strategy. She barely noticed when they reached solid ground. One moment she was being lifted, and the next she was dropped onto damp earth, her body collapsing under its own weight. She gasped, trembling, her vision swimming. The world felt unsteady beneath her. Dane exhaled, muscles tight from exertion, but his grip on the rope remained firm as he dragged himself fully out of the swamp, untangling it from his arm with practiced ease. He had saved himself the same way he had saved her. Avarice lay there, staring up at him, chest rising and falling unevenly. Humans weren't supposed to be stronger, smarter, more adaptable, and yet this one was. Avarice forced herself upright, ignoring the sharp ache in her limbs. She turned her head, locking eyes with him at last. The silence between them was thick, charged with something she couldn't yet name. He was watching her. Not with caution, not with wariness, but with something closer to curiosity. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had expected. Broad shoulders, lean muscle, a face marked by rough edges and determination. His clothes were simple, soaked through with swamp water, but she could tell he was a soldier, not by uniform, but by the way he carried himself. Still, none of it made sense. What was he doing here? Humans had no business in this sector. No human should have been close enough to even see her fall, let alone reach her in time. But the bigger question clawed its way past her lips before she could stop it. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. The human blinked. Why what? Avarice clenched her fists. Why did you save me? He frowned as if the question itself was absurd. Then, after a pause, he let out a breath and shook his head. Because you were drowning. Like it was that simple. Her people would have let her die. They would have weighed the options, considered the losses, and chosen logic over instinct. But this human had seen someone in danger and had acted without a second thought. She swallowed hard, something uneasy curling in her stomach. She didn't understand him. The silence stretched between them, thick with words unspoken. Then, before she could fully process it, he reached out. It was quick, just a brush of his fingers against her wrist. Checking her pulse, she realized a second too late. But the moment his skin met hers, a sharp jolt went through her body. Heat, not just from his touch, but something deeper, something unfamiliar. Her first instinct was to recoil, and she did, jerking back so fast that her breath hitched in her throat. The human stilled, eyes flickering to hers, but he didn't move to touch her again. He simply studied her for a moment, then exhaled and stood. You should rest, he said, scanning the trees around them. We'll move when you're stronger. The word sent another uneasy ripple through her. She should have corrected him, should have made it clear that they were not allies, that they were not, could not be part of any we. But the words didn't come. She sat there, trembling from more than just exhaustion, watching as he turned away to survey their surroundings. He moved like a predator, sharp and sure, scanning for threats, already thinking 3 steps ahead. He belonged in this chaos in a way she never could. A human had saved her. A human had touched her. And worst of all, for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she wanted to be alone. The swamp felt alive. It wasn't just the bubbling sludge beneath their feet or the thick mist curling between skeletal trees. It was something deeper, more insidious, like a predator that had already sunk its teeth in and was simply waiting for its prey to weaken. The air itself was hostile, thick with toxins that left a sharp sting in the lungs and a bitter taste on the tongue. Avarice could feel it working against her body, seeping into her bloodstream, slipping through the delicate balance of her oxygen filtration system. Her species had evolved for precision. Their biology was engineered for controlled environments where every breath was measured, every intake of air refined. But here, in the chaos of an untamed world, her own body was betraying her. Her lungs burned, her skin tingled unpleasantly. Each step felt heavier than the last. And yet, Dane was still moving. The human walked ahead of her, barely seeming to notice the hostile environment pressing down on them. His breathing wasn't labored, his pace hadn't slowed. He wasn't unaffected. She had seen the way his eyes narrowed at the sting of the swamp water, the slight wince when he had first pulled himself onto shore. But whatever discomfort he felt, he was adapting. That was the difference. She was fighting against this place. His body was already compensating for it. Humans, for all their primitive, reckless tendencies, had an undeniable resilience. Their skin was thicker, their metabolic processes crude but efficient. The same biological simplicity her people looked down on was the reason he wasn't faltering. His skin had taken the worst of the exposure, but it acted like a natural barrier, slowing the absorption of toxins. His sweat glands were already working to expel whatever had seeped in. His kidneys, less advanced than her own but remarkably effective, would process and purge the contaminants in a way her system never could. That was why he was still moving while she was struggling to stand. Eris gritted her teeth and forced her legs to obey. She wouldn't fall behind. The ground beneath them was uneven, a mix of gnarled roots, thick mud, and hidden pools of unstable terrain. Dane navigated it easily, stepping over obstacles without hesitation. He moved like someone who had survived in places like this before. His knife was still in his grip, the blade slick with whatever the swamp had coated it with. She hated that she had to rely on him. A flicker of movement caught her eye, something shifting in the mist beyond him. She reacted before she could think. "Move!" Dane barely hesitated. He dropped low just as a dark shape burst from the fog, a blur of shifting plates and jagged limbs. The creature moved like a ghost, its form flickering between visibility and perfect camouflage. A stalk beast. She had heard of them, apex hunters, designed for ambush, their bodies able to mimic their surroundings so seamlessly that even advanced sensors struggled to track them. But now, seeing one in motion, she realized the reports had underestimated them. He was already adapting to their presence. Dane twisted to avoid the first strike, rolling through the mud as claws sliced through the space where he had just stood. He was fast. Not just reactive, but instinctively precise. Before the creature could correct its trajectory, he had already closed the distance, his knife slashing upward in a tight, controlled arc. The blade struck its side, but the chitinous plating was too thick. The impact staggered the beast, but it wasn't enough. Avarice drew her weapon, fingers wrapping tightly around the grip of her energy pistol. She raised it, sighted the shifting mass of the creature's head, and fired. A bolt of plasma seared through the fog, but the stalk beast had already begun to move. The shot grazed its shoulder, a glancing hit that left a trail of blackened exoskeleton. Not enough to kill, not even enough to cripple. Dane didn't wait for another opening. He adjusted in an instant, pivoting to drive his knife under the creature's jaw into the softer, unarmored section of its throat. A sickening crack followed. The beast let out a strangled, gurgling snarl before collapsing. Silence. Avarice exhaled, lowering her weapon, pulse still hammering against her ribs. She had barely registered the fight. It had lasted seconds, but her mind replayed the moment in perfect clarity over and over. The way Dane had moved. No hesitation, no wasted movement, no fear. She had been trained in combat, but her people fought with precision, calculated maneuvers, coordinated strikes, nothing left to chance. But Dane had fought like a predator, pure instinct, adaptation in real time. He pulled his knife free with a sharp, efficient twist, wiping the blade against his sleeve before standing. The faint rise and fall of his chest was the only sign he had exerted himself at all. Then he turned to her, expression unreadable. "Still think you don't need my help?" Avarice scowled, forcing herself to straighten. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of admitting anything. Instead, she stepped past him and crouched over the beast's corpse, pressing her fingers against the damaged plating. The burn from her plasma shot had been minimal. If they encountered more of these things, she would need to aim for the joints, the sections where their natural armor couldn't fully cover. She glanced up at Dane. "Your knife wouldn't have pierced the skull." He raised an eyebrow. "Didn't need to. The throat's faster." She had to admit he wasn't wrong. The kill had been efficient. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Dane shifted his weight slightly, rolling his shoulders. "We can't stay here." Avarice nodded. We need to find stable ground. He glanced at her again, assessing. Then with a small nod he started walking. This time she followed without hesitation. The swamp stretched before them, endless and treacherous, but they were moving forward together. For the first time, Avarice wasn't sure if that was a mistake or a necessary evolution. The swamp had finally relented, giving way to firmer ground beneath their feet. The thick, clinging mud had lessened, replaced by damp, moss-covered earth that didn't threaten to swallow them whole with every step. Above them, the towering trees stretched their skeletal limbs toward the sky, their bioluminescent fungi casting eerie greenish light against the thick mist that still coiled between the trunks. It wasn't safety, nothing about this place was, but it was a reprieve. Varys exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to collapse the moment they stopped. The weight of exhaustion pressed against her body like an iron vice. She hadn't fully recovered from the swamp's toxins. Her breath was still coming shallow, and her limbs ached with every movement, but at least she could stand without feeling like the ground was tilting beneath her. Dane was already scanning the area, his movements efficient, sharp. He was assessing their surroundings, checking for signs of movement, threats, anything that might force them to keep moving. It was instinctive, the way he positioned himself slightly between her and the open space beyond. A subconscious barrier, a protector's stance. The thought unsettled her. "I don't need you to guard me," she muttered. Dane glanced at her, then shrugged. "Never said you did." And yet, he didn't move. Varys swallowed down the irritation rising in her throat. It wasn't that she resented his presence. She had seen firsthand how capable he was, how quickly he adapted, how he survived where others wouldn't. But there was something about it, the effortless way he took up space, the way he moved without hesitation, without fear, that unsettled her. Humans weren't supposed to be like this. She had been raised to believe their kind was crude, ruled by base instincts and a reckless disregard for caution, that they were dangerous because of their unpredictability, their emotions. And yet, this human had done nothing but prove that his instincts were what had kept them alive. And worse, they were what had saved her. She hated that, hated the way it made her feel unsteady, uncertain. She turned away from him, looking out into the mist instead. The stillness of the landscape was unnerving. It felt like something was watching them, waiting. But whether it was another predator or just the swamp itself, she couldn't tell. "We need to keep moving," she said. Dane didn't argue. He simply nodded, slipping his knife back into its sheath before stepping past her. "Come on, then." She followed, ignoring the way her body protested every step. The terrain remained treacherous, the air thick with moisture, but they moved in silence, side by side. Time blurred. There was no way to tell how long they had been walking, only that her body was reaching its limit. The edges of her vision had started to blur again, and each breath felt heavier than the last. Dane must have noticed because after a while he slowed his pace. "We should stop," he said. "You're barely standing." Avarice grit her teeth. "I'm fine." "You're not?" His voice was even, not unkind, but firm. He stopped, turning to look at her fully. "Sit down before you fall down." She hated that he was right, but pride would only get her killed. She exhaled sharply, then sank onto a fallen log, resting her arms on her knees. She wouldn't call it resting, just a brief pause. Dane crouched near her, pulling a small, battered canteen from his belt before handing it to her. She hesitated before taking it. The metal was warm from his body heat, and when she brought it to her lips, the water inside was strange, filtered, but not like the sterile, mineral-balanced liquids she was used to. It tasted raw, almost alive. "You're not used to this, are you?" Dane's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She frowned. "What?" "This, places like this. Environments that don't follow a system." He gestured around them, to the swamp, the trees, the untamed wilderness that stretched beyond them. "You don't belong here." Avarice bristled. "I would have survived." Dane tilted his head slightly, considering her. Maybe. Maybe not. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Your people, they don't build for unpredictability, do they? She went still. It wasn't phrased as an insult, just an observation, a correct one. Her species had spent centuries perfecting their control over nature. Their cities were sealed, climate-regulated, environments meticulously designed to support the optimal conditions for life. Chaos was eliminated before it could ever become a threat. But here there was no control, no system in place to protect her, no calculated measures to ensure survival, just raw, unforgiving nature. Andy. He had no advanced genetic modifications, no internal filtration systems, and yet he was still breathing easier than she was. Her fingers curled slightly around the canteen. It doesn't make sense, she admitted before she could stop herself. Your kind shouldn't be able to endure this as well as you do. Dane raised an eyebrow. Why not? You're biologically inferior. The word slipped out without thought. His lips twitched. Wow, thanks for that. Avaris stiffened. That's not what He chuckled, shaking his head. No, I get it. You think because your people built themselves into something better, that means we're weaker by comparison. He gestured at himself. And yet, here I am. Still alive, still walking. She couldn't argue with that. Dane leaned back, exhaling through his nose. You're looking at it wrong. My kind didn't evolve for perfection. We evolved for survival. His gaze met hers, unwavering. You ever wonder why your people avoid places like this? Why you're struggling and I'm not? Avaris narrowed her eyes. Because you're used to filth and suffering? Dane smirked. Sure, let's go with that. Then more seriously, you filter everything, your bodies, your environments, your air, your food. But the moment something uncontrolled touches you, it throws everything off. He tapped his chest. We don't filter, we adapt. That's the difference. She hated that it made sense. The silence stretched between them, something heavier than before. Then, before she could fully process it, Dane reached out. It was small, just the briefest touch, his fingers grazing the inside of her wrist. She barely had time to react before he pulled back, but it left a strange, lingering warmth against her skin. She stared at him. What was that? Dane shrugged. Checking your pulse? She knew that wasn't true. For a moment the swamp faded around them, the mist, the cold, the exhaustion drowned out by something else entirely. Then Dane pushed himself to his feet. We should keep moving. Heavers didn't argue this time. She just followed, trying to ignore the way her wrist still tingled where he had touched it. The air was thick with the scent of water and damp earth. The oppressive weight of the swamp had lifted, replaced by the soothing murmur of a river cutting through the land like a silver blade. The toxic sludge and decaying pools had faded into the background, leaving behind something that almost felt untouched, a rare sanctuary in a place that had fought them at every step. Dane and Avaris stopped at the riverbank, the cool mist rising from the surface a welcome contrast to the humid heat they had endured for hours. Dane exhaled, rolling his shoulders. This is the first good thing we've found in miles. Avaris was already moving. She stepped to the edge of the water and crouched, dipping her hands into the cool stream. The sensation was jarring, clean, crisp, nothing like the thick, burning sludge that had nearly swallowed her whole. She lifted her hands, watching the droplets slide over her fingers, and for the first time since she had fallen into this cursed place, she felt something close to relief. But relief wasn't enough. Her uniform was ruined, covered in dried filth and toxic residue. Her skin itched with the invisible remnants of the swamp's poison, her white hair tangled, heavy with grime. She couldn't stand it any longer. Without a word, she stood, reached for the clasps of her uniform, and peeled it away. Dane barely had time to register what was happening before she stepped into the water, leaving the tattered remains of her suit on the riverbank. His brain stopped working. She moved through the water with effortless grace, her bare skin catching the faint glow of the bioluminescent fungi along the river's edge. Droplets clung to her in delicate rivulets, running over the smooth lines of her body, trailing down her arms, her back, the curve of her waist. Her long silver-white hair, now wet, clung to her shoulders and cascaded down her spine like a flowing ribbon of light. She tilted her head back, running her fingers through the strands, her throat exposed as she let the water cascade over her. Dane was staring hard. He knew he should look away. He really should. But damn. His pulse thundered against his ribs, his fingers unconsciously tightening at his sides. He had seen beautiful things before, planets burning in a dying sunset, the vastness of space stretching infinitely beyond his reach. But none of it compared to this. None of it compared to her. Avarice glanced at him over her shoulder, catching his expression. A slow, knowing smirk curved her lips. "Are you going to keep staring?" Dane exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "Not my fault you decided to strip down without warning." Avarice huffed a quiet laugh. "I thought humans were used to physicality." Dane smirked. "Not when it looks like you were carved out of a damn dream." Avarice blinked. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, maybe? Or something deeper. But she didn't look away. For the first time, she realized he wasn't unaffected by her. For a species that was supposed to be so emotionally reckless, Dane had been surprisingly controlled. But now she saw it. The way his breathing had changed, the tension in his stance, the way his gaze lingered on her just a second too long before he forced himself to look away. And she liked it. She didn't know why, but the knowledge sent a strange thrill through her. Dane exhaled, shaking his head before pulling off his shirt and stepping into the water after her. Avarice's gaze flickered over him instinctively, taking in the lean muscle, the scars that stretched over his torso, marks of battles he didn't speak of. He waded in beside her, stopping just close enough that she could feel his heat, even through the cool water. "We never actually introduced ourselves properly, did we?" Avarice arched an eyebrow. "No, I suppose not." Dane smirked slightly. "I'm Dane." "Verse," she replied softly. Their names hung between them, heavier than they should have been. Then, after a pause, Avarice spoke again. "Why are you here, Dane?" Dane's smirk faded. For the first time since she had met him, something unreadable crossed his face. "You're just now asking that?" he muttered. Avarice's gaze hardened. "I know why I'm here, but you," she gestured around them, "a human being on this planet is not normal." Dane exhaled through his nose. Then, after a long pause, "I was discarded." Avarice frowned. "What?" Dane's jaw tensed. "I was a soldier, special forces, did what I was told, until I didn't." He lifted his gaze to hers, something cold flickering beneath the surface. "I disobeyed orders in a battle that should have never happened, so they threw me away." Avarice stilled. She understood now. She knew what it felt like to be deemed expendable. Her chest tightened. For the first time, she realized they weren't just two survivors. They were the same. Dane studied her as if waiting for her reaction. Finally, Avarice inhaled slowly. "My people don't abandon their own." Her voice was steady, but something about the way she said it felt hollow. Dane tilted his head slightly. "Then why did they leave you?" Avarice looked away, her throat tightening. "Because I wasn't like them," she admitted. "I questioned too much, thought too much, I felt too much." Her fingers curled at her sides. "And in my world, that is a flaw." Dane's expression darkened. "So they dumped you here." Aberys let out a quiet breath. It was the logical choice. Dane stared at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice softer than she expected, "That's bullshit." She blinked. "What?" Dane took a slow step forward. "They did it because they were afraid of you." His voice was low, sure. "Afraid that you weren't like them. Afraid that you were something they couldn't control." Aerys swallowed hard, because part of her knew he was right. For the first time she felt something crack. Then Dane reached out. It was small, just a touch, his fingers brushing against her wrist. But she didn't pull away. And then, before she could second-guess it, he kissed her. The river flowed around them, but in that moment, it didn't exist. There was only heat, hands, the quiet sound of a breath catching. Averys's mind went blank. She should have pulled away. She should have questioned it. But she didn't. She leaned into him, her fingers curling against his chest, her breath mingling with his. For the first time, neither of them felt alone. The landscape had shifted. For days, Dane and Averys had pushed forward through the suffocating swamps, their bodies weighed down by exhaustion and the relentless, sticky heat. The air had burned in their lungs, thick with decay and the stench of stagnant water. Every step had been a battle, against the sinking mud, against unseen predators, against the lingering poison in Averys' vein. But now, the world around them had changed. The ground beneath their boots was no longer treacherous, no longer pulling them under. It was firm stone, cracked and weathered but stable. The heavy trees, their roots tangled like the fingers of a dying god, had thinned, revealing something beyond the natural wilds. Ruins. Dane slowed, his instincts sharpening. Ahead, jagged metal spires jutted from the earth like broken bones, half buried beneath the weight of time. The air here carried an unnatural stillness, as if the land itself had been abandoned along with the structures that remained. His grip tightened on the knife at his waist. "This place," he muttered. Averys followed his gaze, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "It was a facility," she said after a moment. "Military, most likely." Dane let out a slow breath. "Human?" Averys stepped toward a rusted panel embedded in the ground, brushing away layers of dirt. Symbols barely visible beneath the corrosion emerged. Not just human script, but her people's language as well. She stilled. Dane caught the hesitation immediately. Not just human, then. Averys's jaw tensed. No. This was a joint installation. Dane exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Which means your people knew about this place." She didn't answer. Instead, she kept moving, her pace quickening. Dane hesitated only a moment before falling into step beside her. He didn't like this. The silence felt deliberate, as if someone had erased the past and left nothing but ghosts. The deeper they ventured into the ruins, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an outpost. It was something more. The central structure loomed ahead, its entrance half buried beneath debris. The insignia above the doorway had faded, but the meaning was unmistakable. Human and alien symbols intertwined. Dane brushed his fingers over the worn metal. "This is it." Averys studied the entrance, then turned to him. "Help me." Together they pried the rusted doors open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the faint metallic tang of rusted steel. Dead monitors lined the walls, their screens cracked and dark, but one thing still flickered weakly in the center of the room, a single terminal, pulsing with the remnants of old power. Dane shot Averys a look. "Think you can wake it up?" She was already at the console, her fingers brushing over the cracked interface. The technology was crude by her people's standards, but not beyond her understanding. With careful precision, she rerouted what little energy remained, coaxing the machine back to life. A string of garbled text flickered across the screen. Evacuation protocol activated. UN announced personnel detected. Terminal connection. Lost main. Data core offline. Aver's breath caught. There was an evacuation plan. Dane leaned over her shoulder. Does it say where? She tried to access the coordinates, but the data was corrupted. Another warning flashed across the screen. Data incomplete. Relocate to U-Plate node for recovery. Avarice clenched her jaw. The information we need isn't stored here. The main system was disconnected. Dane exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Then where the hell is it? A new message flickered onto the screen. Last transmission log. Signal relay, orbital satellite network. Aversey's eyes widened. There's a satellite still transmitting. Dane straightened. A working uplink. She nodded. If we can reach the right relay, we might be able to access the rest of the evacuation data. Dane smirked. So our way off this rock is locked in a computer floating in space? Everest met his gaze, her expression unwavering. If it's still active, we can retrieve the data. There must be a ground-based relay nearby. Dane sighed. And I bet it's in the most dangerous place possible. Avarice smirked. Wouldn't be worth it otherwise. Dane chuckled, shaking his head. You and your damn logic. She stepped closer, her body nearly brushing his. It's kept us alive so far. Something flickered between them, not just survival, but understanding. Dane held her gaze, something warm curling in his chest. Then, without a word, he reached for her hand. Avarice didn't pull away. Her fingers were warm against his, firm yet delicate. The simple contact sent a strange sensation running through him, something grounding, something real. They stood there for a moment, neither acknowledging the shift, neither letting go. Then Avarice turned toward the ruins ahead. We need to move, she said quietly. Dane gave her hand a light squeeze before releasing it. Then let's go find our way out. And together, side by side, they walked deeper into the unknown. The descent into the ruins felt heavier than any journey they had made before. The air was thick with dust and memories, the scent of rusted metal clinging to every breath. The deeper they went, the colder it became, as if the shadows themselves were holding on to secrets too old to be spoken aloud. Dane walked slightly ahead, his grip firm on Avera's hand. It had become second nature now, this silent tether between them. Neither questioned it, neither let go. The facility was a graveyard, its walls lined with the skeletons of past ambitions. Broken terminals flickered, their screens shattered but still glowing faintly, whispering echoes of something that had long since died. Avera's fingers tightened around Dane's. This place. He glanced at her. Her face was unreadable, but he could feel the tension in her grip, the way her usually steady breath had hitched ever so slightly. She recognized this. Not the place itself, but what it had been. Dane let out a slow exhale. You've seen something like this before? Avarice didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, brushing her fingers over a rusted panel embedded in the wall. The symbols were faded, but she didn't need them to be clear. She already knew what they meant. This wasn't just a prison, she murmured. Dane waited. He knew better than to rush her. Avarice swallowed. It was a testing ground. Dane's stomach twisted. He had suspected as much, but hearing it in her voice made it real. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. My people don't abandon things without reason. If this facility was shut down, it means something here went wrong. Very wrong. Dane's gaze swept the corridor ahead. Then let's find out what... They moved in unison, the silence between them no longer just caution, it was anticipation. Dread. And then they found the doors. Massive reinforced steel, untouched by time. Unlike the others, these hadn't fallen to decay. They had been sealed deliberately. Avarice ran a hand over the control panel. The system was fried, but she could still feel the faint hum of residual power beneath her fingertips. "This was locked from the inside," she murmured. Dane tensed. "Then whatever's in there, either someone wanted to keep it hidden," Avarice met his gaze, "or keep it contained." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with careful precision, Avarice bypassed the security overrides. The lock disengaged. The doors groaned open. And inside was hell. Rows of containment chambers lined the walls, their glass cracked and smeared with something dark. The air was stale, suffocating. The faint glow of emergency lighting cast twisted shadows across the room. Dane stepped forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. He already knew what he was looking at before he saw the records flashing on the screens. The skeletal remains inside the chambers, they hadn't been prisoners. They had been subjects. Avarice inhaled sharply, her breath shallow. Dane turned to her. This wasn't just a research station. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It was a biological warfare site. A new line of text flickered onto one of the surviving monitors. Experimental Program, Project Genesis. Biotic Weaponization Phase 3. UN entering. Redirect to detected. System failure. Avarice's fingers curled into fists. They weren't just studying the environment. They were creating something. Dane's jaw tightened, and they lost control. The screen blinked, and for a moment an image appeared, a distorted security feed from years ago, a hallway filled with figures in hazmat suits, running, screaming. The feed cut to static, then to another frame, something moving in the darkness, too fast, too unnatural. And then nothing. Avarice reached for the terminal, her hands shaking. Her entire life she had been trained to believe that her people acted with precision, with reason. But this is why they never came back, she whispered. Dane was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to her, his voice low but steady. "We need to get out of here." Avarice didn't move. Her gaze was locked onto the terminal, onto the remnants of something she had never been meant to see. Dane stepped closer. "Avarice." She flinched, her breath catching. Then she turned, and suddenly her hands were on his face. He barely had time to react before her lips were on his, fierce and desperate, like she was trying to silence the weight of everything they had just uncovered. Dane's mind went blank for half a second. Then he was kissing her back. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. His hands found her waist, pulling her closer, grounding her. She melted into him, her body flush against his, her fingers threading into his hair. The taste of urgency lingered between them. This wasn't just desire, it was need. When they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his, both of them breathing hard. Dane exhaled a short, shaky laugh. "Well, that's one way to cope." Avarice let out something between a chuckle and a sigh, her fingers still resting against his jaw. "You talk too much." Dane smirked. "I thought you liked my voice." Her lips brushed against his again, softer this time. Less desperation, more certainty. "I do," she admitted. Dane's chest tightened. His hand slid down her arm, his fingers curling around hers. "Then let's get the hell out of here." Avarice nodded, but just as she turned, Dane tightened his grip. She looked back, confusion flickering across her face. Dane's throat felt tight, but he didn't let himself hesitate. "I love you." Avarice blinked. For a moment she just stared at him. Then, slowly, a smile ghosted across her lips. Small, but real. "I love you too." Dane grinned. "Took you long enough?" She rolled her eyes, but the warmth in them didn't fade. "Shut up and run, Dane." And together, hand in hand, they sprinted toward whatever future waited for them. The wind howled through the remains of the abandoned facility, carrying with it the whispers of a past that had long since been buried. The morning light cast eerie shadows across the cracked ground, illuminating the scars of a world that had been forsaken. Dane and Averies stood at the edge of it all, their breath heavy, their bodies aching, but their resolve unshaken. The truth lay before them now, laid bare in the cold, lifeless corridors they had just escaped. This planet was never just a prison. It was a test. Averies clenched her fists as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The records she had decrypted, the scattered transmissions they had uncovered, all pointed to the same chilling reality. This world had once been a classified research and development site for bioweapons, a joint project between humans and her own people. The facility they had found had been just one of many, spread across the surface like a disease, all working toward the same goal, to create the perfect living weapon. But something had gone wrong. The experiments had grown beyond their control. Whether it was due to a breach, sabotage, or simple arrogance, the outcome had been the same. Containment had failed. The test subjects had escaped into the wild, mutating, evolving, turning the planet itself into a living nightmare. The prison colony had been a cover story, a convenient excuse. The governments behind the project had needed a way to justify keeping the planet sealed, so they had turned it into a dumping ground for their undesirables, a place where criminals, exiles, and political threats could be disposed of under the guise of justice. No one was ever meant to leave. No one was ever meant to know. Averies swallowed hard, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "They didn't just abandon this planet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They erased it." Dane's expression was unreadable, his jaw set as he absorbed the truth. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath. "And they left us here to die, with it." Silence hung between them. And then, the distant roar of an engine. Averies snapped her head toward the horizon. The satellite uplink had given them a set of coordinates, a last-ditch chance at escape. If the records were correct, there was still a shuttle docked at an auxiliary launch platform, one last vessel that had been forgotten when the facility was abandoned. And now they were close. Dane reached for her hand, his grip firm and grounding. "We don't have time to think about the past," he said. "Right now, we get to that ship, and we leave this place behind." Averies met his gaze. She had spent so long questioning, searching for answers, but for the first time she realized that the truth no longer mattered. Only the future did. She gave his hand a squeeze. "Then let's go." Together they ran. The launch site was barely standing. The structure had been half swallowed by time, rusted catwalks crumbling into the dirt, the remains of old shuttles strewn like carcasses of creatures long extinct. But at the center of it all, one ship remained intact. It was smaller than she had expected, built for rapid extractions rather than long-haul travel. The hull was scarred but whole, and, most importantly, it still had power. Dane skidded to a stop beside the docking ramp, his fingers flying over the control panel. The door hissed open, stale air rushing out like the breath of a sleeping giant. Averies darted inside first, moving toward the cockpit. The screens flickered as she powered up the main systems, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "Tell me this thing can still fly," Dane called from behind her, sealing the entrance. Averies scanned the diagnostics. The engines were old, the fuel levels dangerously low, but the core systems were online. "It'll get us off this rock," she said, "but we won't have much range." Dane collapsed into the co-pilot seat with a smirk. "I'll take it." Averies worked quickly, keying in the launch sequence. The engines rumbled beneath them, the ship shuddering as it shook off years of neglect. Outside, the facility's remains blurred in the heat waves of the thrusters. Dane's gaze lingered on the landscape through the viewport. "We should blow the place to hell." Averies hesitated, then pulled up the system logs. The shuttle's emergency fail-safes were still intact. If she overloaded the core, the resulting explosion would collapse what remained of the facility, wiping out everything. The choice was easy. She engaged the sequence, locking in a countdown. As the engines roared to life, she turned to Dane. her expression steady. "There's nothing left for us here." Dane gave a slow nod. "Then let's go." The ship lifted. The ground trembled beneath them, the facility vanishing in a cloud of dust and fire as the shuttle punched through the atmosphere, breaking free from the planet's grasp. Avarice exhaled, her body going weightless as they ascended. They had done it. They were free. Space stretched before them, endless, open, full of possibilities. Dane leaned back in his seat, a tired grin tugging at his lips. "So?" he said, glancing at her. "What now?" Eris let out a slow breath. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she had no orders to follow, no path dictated by duty or survival. And she wasn't alone. She turned to him, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "We decide that together?" Dane studied her for a moment, then reached for her hand again, his fingers intertwined with hers, warm, steady. He gave her hand a light squeeze. "I love you," he said softly. Evers's chest tightened, something indescribable blooming in her throat. She had spent her entire life believing that love was a weakness, that emotions were a liability. But here, in the cold vastness of space, it felt like the only thing keeping her tethered to something real. She squeezed his hand in return. "I love you too." The stars stretched before them, infinite and waiting. And together they flew toward the unknown. It had taken weeks to find a new home. After escaping the forsaken planet, Dane and Avaris had drifted through the vast emptiness of space, relying on whatever little fuel and supplies their stolen shuttle had left. They had no clear destination, only the desperate need to leave behind the ghosts of the past. Navigating through uncharted systems, they had finally stumbled upon Vareth IV, a planet barely mentioned in old star maps, untouched by war, unclaimed by empires. It had breathable air, fertile land, and a sky so vast it made the past seem small. For the first time they had a choice. Avarice had turned to him, the question unspoken in her eyes. Dane had simply reached for her hand and said, "Let's stay." And so they had. The air on Vareth IV was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of alien flora that rustled gently in the evening breeze. The twin moons hung low on the horizon, their pale glow spilling across the quiet landscape. From the hills, the distant hum of life filled the air. A world untouched by war, by experiments, by the ghosts of a forsaken planet. Here, Dane and Avaris had built a home. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. A sturdy structure nestled against the edge of a forest, its walls warmed by the soft glow of solar lanterns. Inside, it smelled of cooked food and something softer, something that smelled like home. Avaris stood at the small kitchen counter, her silver-white hair tucked loosely behind her pointed ears, a faint crease between her brows as she stirred the pot simmering over the stove. Her people did not cook, not the way humans did, but Dane had introduced her to the art of it, and now she found a strange kind of peace in the simplicity of preparing a meal. The front door slid open, and the sound of boots against the floor made her smile. Dane exhaled as he stepped inside, rolling his shoulders, his movements slow with exhaustion. His work at the colony's outpost was physically demanding, but it was honest work. No war, no killing, just building something that would last. He smelled the food before he even reached the kitchen, and a grin tugged at his lips. "You made that thing I like?" Varys glanced at him over her shoulder. "You're going to have to be more specific." He chuckled, stepping up behind her, his arm slipping around her waist, pulling her against him. She smelled like spices, her warmth instantly dissolving the tension in his muscles. "You know what I mean," he murmured against her neck, his lips brushing her skin. Avarice inhaled, tilting her head slightly, but she continued stirring. "It's still cooking." Dane groaned, pressing his forehead against her shoulder. "You're cruel," she smirked. You say that, but you love it." He sighed dramatically, then pulled back just enough to spin her around, caging her between him and the counter. She looked up at him, her blue skin glowing softly under the warm light, her eyes filled with that familiar fire that always seemed to pull him in. "I do," he admitted, brushing his fingers along her jaw. "I love you." Everest's lips parted slightly, and though she had heard those words before, they still made her breath hitch. She let her fingers trail up his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her touch. "Then you'll wait for dinner?" Dane exhaled a soft laugh. "Fine." But before he pulled away, he captured her lips in a slow, deep kiss. She melted against him, her fingers tightening in his shirt as his hands skimmed the small of her back, pulling her closer, breathing her in. By the time he finally released her, her pulse was no longer steady. Everest licked her lips, glancing at the stove. "The food will burn." Dane smirked. "Let it." She shot him a glare, but he only winked and stepped back, pulling off his jacket and tossing it over the chair before collapsing onto the couch. Everest turned back to the stove, rolling her eyes, but there was no hiding the small smile on her lips. Later that night, the meal had been good. Too good, apparently, because Dane had eaten like a starved man and now lay sprawled across the bed, one arm slung lazily over his eyes. Everest sat beside him, cross-legged, watching him with amusement. "You act like you fought a battle today." Dane let out a deep groan. "I lifted crates, heavy crates." She smirked, tilting her head. "Poor thing." Dane huffed, peeking at her through half-lidded eyes. "You have no idea. I might not recover." Everest rolled her eyes. Then, suddenly, a glimmer of something playful, something dangerous flashed across her face. "Then I suppose I'll have to take control," she murmured. Before Dane could respond, she moved. With a slow, deliberate motion, Everest climbed over him, straddling his waist, her cool fingertips grazing his abdomen as she settled against him. Dane's breath hitched. He hadn't expected that. Everest smirked down at him, a mischievous glint in her violet eyes. "You look surprised." Dane exhaled slowly, his hands instinctively coming to rest on her hips. "I wasn't expecting you to be so assertive." She tilted her head, considering. Then, leaning down, she brushed her lips against the side of his jaw, her breath warm against his skin. "You assume too much," she whispered. Dane swallowed, his pulse suddenly louder in his ears. Everest had always been deliberate, precise, but this was something else entirely. She moved against him, slow, unhurried, learning him in a way she never had before. Every brush of her fingers, every shift of her body against his was intentional, teasing, testing. Dane groaned, his hands tightening slightly on her waist. "You're enjoying this." Everest let out a quiet hum, trailing her lips down his throat, her teeth grazing just enough to make him shudder. Her people were not raised to explore pleasure like this, not like humans. It had always been something clinical, practical, never about sensation, never about losing oneself in another. But with Dane it was different. She wanted to hear the way his breath hitched. She wanted to feel the way his body reacted beneath her. And most of all, she wanted to take her time. Dane's fingers slid up her back, pulling her closer, his breath unsteady. The slow burn between them, the tension they had ignored for so long, was unraveling in measured, intoxicating increments. Everest pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, her lips slightly parted, her cheeks flushed in a way he had never seen before. He had never seen her like this, completely unguarded. His chest tightened. "You're beautiful." Everest blinked, caught off guard. "You always say that?" Dane smirked, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "Because it's always true." She hesitated, then, with no more doubt, no more restraint, she kissed him. It was slow at first, a deliberate press of lips, warm and searching, but then Dane pulled her fully against him and the kiss deepened. Avarice sighed against his mouth, the sound dissolving into something sweeter, needier. His hands roamed up her back, fingers tangling in her long silken hair. She had always been composed, careful, but now she was coming undone beneath his touch. And dang, he was already lost in her. His hands slid lower, gripping her thighs as she shifted against him, her body fitting perfectly against his. She gasped softly, the sensation new, electrifying. Her fingers raked over his chest, her nails barely scratching against his skin, sending a shiver down his spine. "Avarice," he murmured, voice rough with something unspoken. She pressed her forehead against his, breathing heavily. This moment, this heat between them, it was unlike anything she had ever known. "I love you," she whispered. Dane's breath stilled, and then a slow, breathtaking smile spread across his lips. "I love you too." Avarice's lips curved, then she kissed him again, fierce, claiming, no hesitation this time. No more restraint, no more holding back. Tonight they were only themselves, together in a world that finally belonged to them.